What's new?
I'm Zev Elef, Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College and Hebrew Theological College, and I'm so delighted to be speaking today with Professor Sara Hirschhorn. She is the visiting assistant professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern University. Her book out of Harvard University Press, City on Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli Settler Movement, was the Choice Award winner for the 2018 Sammy Rohr Prize, which basically means it's one of the best books written in Jewish history in the last couple of years, and it really is. And our business today is to discuss, to texturize the relationship between American Zionism and Israel. I think it's fair to suggest that historians to date have painted with a very sanguine, very positive brush. And that meant highlighting certain figures. Your work is done looking in around the 1967, which was really a watershed moment. Really is emblematic of what I think is a new trend in the field, to take various themes and ideas at fuller depth. So thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for being with me. It's thrilled to be here. I love talking about this subject, so this is a great deal of fun in the midst of some dark times.
Absolutely. So how can we complicate the history of American Zionism? And I'm eager to hear about the entire sweep of American Zionist history, but maybe from the 1940s and 1950s onward, what type of trajectory ought we to consider when trying to better understand America and Israel?
So I think American Zionism has been painted with a very broad brush, and we've highlighted some significant figures that are notable in the American Jewish lexicon who are actively involved in the Zionist movement, although we could also put a little bit more emphasis not only on those who, I think represent a kind of liberal Zionism or a traditional American Zionism, but also those who have been lost to the canon that represent a more, a more white ring string of Zionism in America, revisionist Zionism. Prior to the Second World War, there's been some work done in that area. But I think we generally have this kind of, happy picture of American Zionist engagement prior to the founding of the State of Israel, which is true, but it also discounts some other threads within the American Jewish experience, notably non-Zionism and even anti-Zionism that existed prior to 1948, and also makes the assumption that the American Jewish community was really actively involved in support of the Zionist cause, which just really doesn't reflect the average American Jewish experience prior to 1948 and really up until 1967. Between 1948 and 1967, I think we also see another significant shift, which is that the American Jewish community, or particularly the establishment American Jewish community, actually feels quite threatened by the establishment of the State of Israel and its interest in assimilation into the United States prior to this post-Second World War. We have the AJC issuing the Ben-Gurion-Blaustein agreement, essentially coming to a kind of non-interference pact between Israel and the American Jewish community, which I think symbolizes the real ambivalence that American Jews had about the founding of the State of Israel. Certainly between 1948 and 1967, there is an enthusiastic engagement by the average American Jew regarding the founding of the State of Israel, and certainly much less ambivalence than there is today. I can remember my grandparents who would serve sort of cocktail hour before Shabbat, with toothpicks that would have the American flag on one side and the Israeli flag on the other side, and there was absolutely no sense in their part that there was any contradiction or ambivalence or problematics of having this sort of united sense of American Judaism. That was their generation, the post-war generation that, very much affiliated in that way. But I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that, American Jews, especially the institutions of American Jewish life, felt quite as strongly or felt completely unequivocally in support of the Zionist enterprise without reflecting on what it might mean for the American Jewish experience.
Many historians will point to the dollars fundraised as betokening somehow American Jewish support. What for Israel? What other sources can we look at to better understand the more nuanced relationship?
So there's been actually quite a number of interesting books that have been published recently about American Zionism and material culture, the way that American Jews were, buying products from Israel in their synagogue gift shop, or modeling clothes that were, supported by, the American women's Zionist movement at Hadassah. So, there certainly was this kind of lay interest and lay engagement with Israel, and a kind of, armchair or synagogue activism that, included philanthropy, but also other ways of engaging within Israel that was still, at that time quite remote. The prospect of travel to Israel, even at that time, was, so much different than it is today. And I think it's very hard for us to remember that, it wasn't just a matter of getting on an airplane and, flying from, JFK to Israel the way we might do today. It was a much more difficult process after 1948. So, there is a lot of interesting work being done about, how people could engage with Israel. But I think it was very much on a material and philanthropic level, rather than deep political, ideological, or spiritual engagement with Israel, which really comes after 1967.
And what is it about 1967? It's complicated. It's much more complicated than declarations that this was a miracle. There's much more to it about 67.
I mean, I argue in my book, and I will, continue to advance this thesis here, that it's also about other processes that are happening in the United States around the 1967 war, about Jewish Americans discovering their hyphenated identities, along with many other white, quote unquote, white ethnics and other groups within the United States. That, when the United States is moving from kind of a melting pot culture to an identity politics frame, American Jews benefit from this in certain ways, and the 1967 war, nicely coincides with this moment, and allows American Jews, I think, to express themselves and identify with the American Jewish experience, but also Zionism in a way that they hadn't before.
And was it that the 67 war meant this release of Jewish identity politics, of this hyphenization identity, or are there indicators even in the years before that Jews were starting to look for something like this?
I think there are indicators already in the years before that. I mean, we see, a lot of efforts by Jews to engage around the major questions of the day in the 60s and 70s, but explicitly as Jews and not just as Americans, or at least as, hyphenated Jewish Americans. So I think this was already present in the American Jewish discourse, but the association with Israel and Israel's, victory in the 1967 war, I think, emboldens American Jewry also to associate with concepts of Jewish nationalism and Jewish power in a way that they hadn't before. I think also the concurrent rise of other power movements, say Black Power and its transnational relationship with the Palestinians, and other, at that time, the larger Third Worldism movement also requires Jewish power, or Israel and her diaspora allies, to react in other ways and to sort of deepen their own connections there as well.
And so the decade before this, in the 1950s, essentially Will Herberg had written Protestant Catholic Jew, essentially convincing Jews that they were 1/3 of the population. This is Kevin Schultz's Tri-Faith America. This is Judeo-Christian values. And so the Jewish project was to be American, was to be one of the triple melting pot
Right.
avenues. And so how does that sense of that project of being American, is there evidence that Jews were there somehow became more abrasive towards the Zionist project, particularly in the 1950s?
that you mean that American Jewry writ large was beginning to reject the Zionist project?
Not reject Zionist project, but that whatever momentum could have been gained, could have been accrued in the post-48 period, well, Jews were busy convincing themselves that, in fact, this was the time that we had finally made it in Protestant America.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it wasn't a rejection of the Zionist project. It was just that the Zionist project was sort of ancillary to the American Jewish experience in a certain way. And that, this was, the days where American Jews were kind of reaching the pinnacle of assimilation, or at least what they thought was the pinnacle up until then. And other than a kind of armchair interest in what was happening overseas, the focus was obviously on life, especially in a post-war life, of restarting America and restarting Judaism on different shores, and particularly in the United States as a welcome home for Jewish refugees, but also those who are already in the United States, of starting a new chapter of the American Jewish experience.
Right. And what I love about your thesis is that it does well to explain how Jewish identity can be simultaneously wrapped up in one's religious or cultural identity, but also with a national one. And if you're looking as an outsider, these are different concepts. These are apples and oranges. But in the context of the 1960s, with Judaism becomes both an ethnicity and nationalism, it becomes all things.
Yeah, and I think that's also how, this also becomes a very big problem post 1967 for American Jews to try and then square their American politics with their Jewish politics, and becomes, I think, leads to some of the or was the first iteration, rather, I would say, of some of the dilemmas that we're seeing today of how do we how do American Jews navigate an identity politics universe that doesn't necessarily see the same conflicts as the American Jewish public does.
It creates an unevenness that you can no longer map yourself out onto the current topography of American politics.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, the heydays of Catholic, Protestant, Jew were more helpful to American Jewry than the days of identity politics. We can say a lot of bad things about the melting pot concept of assimilation, but identity politics also brings about its own problems for the Jews.
And what about religious leadership, particularly in the 1967, and how they were able to synergize their mandate towards their religious affiliation and coalesce that with Israel pride, Israel identity, and Israeli politics?
Right. I mean, I think this is the moment where we can say that religio-nationalism is born in the United States, or at least in terms of American Jewry. I mean, it also coincides with another moment of reckoning about the Holocaust and about deeper engagement in moral questions of the 60s and 70s that American Jewry and even religious or Orthodox American Jewry were engaged in. So it comes against a backdrop of other changes in religious life or Orthodox life, but it's certainly a moment that captivates American Jewish religious leaders, and they see it as for some it's the evidence of a miracle or some kind of God's hand in history that had been absent, or at least thought to be absent in some ways during the Holocaust, and it's a real moment kind of restoration and renaissance of I think the American religious experience actually writ large. There are a lot of really interesting things that happened in American religion in the 1960s and 1970s against the backdrop of the counterculture and other simultaneous movements. But certainly for American Jews, this is really a moment of change, and I think of kind of reckoning with the past in a positive way, also sort of charting a new way forward.
Right. So it's so interesting as well. This is a formative and critical moment. I know of no other period in American Jewish history that sets forth such a legacy of unevenness and complicating factors and forces in this period.
I think it's also, we're also seeing, the evidence of the denominational split very early on in issues that don't necessarily have to do with Israel, but are part of the larger dilemmas of American Jewry confronting change in the 1960s and 1970s. You constantly see these, Supreme Court decisions where Agudat Yisrael and some of the Orthodox, institutions are siding against other parts of other, institutions or denominations of American Judaism on, questions like on affirmative action and some other racial issues that come up in the 1960s and 1970s. So Israel is one part of the denominational split, but not the only one. And these, I think the domestic and the transnational increasingly become linked around questions of privilege that emerge after. So there's a lot happening in that time.
Thanks for clicking and learning. And here are some links to related videos. And subscribe. Don't miss out to making meaning of the past in the present for the future.